what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to walk you through the key scientists who helped to contribute to our current understanding of the atom. And the first person was Dalton. Now, while Dalton's postulates might seem lacking as far as details are concerned, what you need to remember is the fact that he didn't have the technology in order to know about subatomic particles. And so what he came up with, these postulates, are actually quite incredible based on the fact that he knew so little about what atoms were made up of and what exactly constituted an atom. So the first part of Dalton's atomic theory states that all matter is made up of tiny particles made up of atoms, or called atoms. The second is that all atoms of a given element are identical to one another and different from atoms of other elements. So for example, chlorine is different than bromine, but all chlorine atoms are identical to one another, and we will look in detail at what makes them different from one another later in this chapter. The third postulate that Dalton had was the fact that atoms of two or more different elements combine to form compounds. Now, a particular compound is always made up of the same kinds of atoms and the same number of each kind of atom. So, for example, water, H2O. H2O has 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen always. If you change the number of hydrogens or you change the number of oxygens, you change the compound. And the last thing that Dalton stated was that a chemical reaction involves the rearrangement, separation, or combination of atoms. He noted that atoms are never created or destroyed during a chemical reaction, and we're actually going to look at this in detail when we get to our chemical reaction section of this class. But the main thing for you to know is that whenever a chemical reaction occurs, you're not losing atoms. Instead, they're simply rearranging, they're separating from one another, combining with other ones in order to form new compounds. The next scientist we're going to talk about is Thomson. Now, J.J. Thomson is credited with discovering the electron. And so what he used, what you can see right here, this is a cathode ray tube. So he shot cathode rays, which are simply beams of electrons which have a negative charge, through this tube, and what he noted was the fact that these electrons were deflected by the negatively charged electrode, but attracted to the positively charged electrode. And what this told him was, number one, there are subatomic particles called electrons. Right? An atom is not simply an atom. You can break it down further into subatomic particles. And those electrons have a negative charge. Now, what he thought happened, or what an atom consisted of, was an overall positive charge, which is represented with this pink circle, and that there are simply electrons that are dispersed throughout the atom. And this model is called the plum pudding model. Now, this is not our current understanding of the atom. This is not correct, but for the time, for Thomson's time, that was very revolutionary, because up until that point they had assumed that an atom could not be broken down into simpler parts. Now, Rutherford was Thomson's student, and so he was trying to provide evidence for the plum pudding model, but instead he actually proved the plum pudding model incorrect. So what he did was he took a source that provided alpha particles, and he shot those alpha particles, which are positively charged, through gold foil. Now, if Thomson's model of the atom was correct, all of those positively charged alpha particles should have shot straight through the atom, because the positive charge of this entire atom is not very concentrated. But instead what he found was a number of them actually did pass through, but some of them were deflected, and there was no explanation for why they were deflected until Rutherford came up with this idea of the nucleus, in which you have a concentration of positive charges. Now, the majority of an atom is empty space, while the nucleus, which takes up very little space, has all of the positive charge, which means it's extremely concentrated. And so that explained why, when alpha particles were shot into the gold foil, some of them were deflected, as you can see in this diagram. So Rutherford discovered protons and this concept of a nucleus rather than the plum pudding model. And finally, Chadwick came along and he discovered neutrons. So at this moment, we've got the nucleus with protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged and neutrons are neutrally charged. And then the electrons are outside of the nucleus. Now, for the moment, we can say that they're orbiting the nucleus, but as you'll learn in future chapters, that's actually not what they're doing. But remember, while all of the mass is found in the nucleus of an atom, the majority of the space that's taken up is actually just empty space.